Hi everybody, thank you for joining me today. In today's lesson, I wanted to bring up something that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that's building narrative devices in your phrasing and soloing. And I'm going to use the Fade to Black solo as a reference or as an example. Um, when I first started learning the solo, it was to do a lesson on playing more melodically. But as I started working on that, I felt like trying to ask someone to play more melodically was very vague because I started looking at definitions just to kind of get people more comfortable with the idea of what melody is. Of course, a melody, and of course, in music, you need melody, harmony, and rhythm. But to play more melodically, it feels more vague to explain it that way. Because some of the definitions for melody, it's things like a succession of notes that sounds pleasing, which is vague. But I found this definition about melodic phrase that I really loved, and it goes, a phrase like a sentence slash clause in verbal language encompasses a complete musical statement. The reason I like that a lot, because when I think about playing melodically now, I think about it as having a conversation with a listener with your playing, building a story, maybe a narrative, something that reflects maybe the song itself. Um, to me, the song's very dark. If you look at the lyrics, it's very dark, but the word, for me, the way I interpreted everything is centered around hope, and I'll explain that later. Another thing, too, this lesson isn't about me teaching the solo, it's more about using the solo as an example for these narrative devices. All right, let's get started. So, the opening phrase tells us everything about the solo, and I'll explain here in a bit. With that opening phrase, we get the entire solo through variations and different devices. But I want to talk about those devices first. The first one being bending. To me, when you think about it in a narrative way, bending could be one or two things. Either its own statement, like you hear a lot in guitar music, like the blues, like it could be just a statement on its own, or like in the opening phrase, part of the phrase. Now, the note is being highlighted in this phrase, but the whole phrase isn't centered around that note. It's just one of the highlights. So thinking of it like that. The other thing is not exactly what is being played, but how it's being played. And what I'm talking about is a minor pentatonic scale. It's used a lot in Kirk Hammett's playing, but in this song in particular, it's basically the skeletal system of the entire song. But how he uses it very tastefully is going in and out from the minor pentatonic scale to the natural minor scale. And he highlights this G, which is the sixth degree of the scale. He builds this relationship between this F sharp, which is the fifth, and that G. And I'll explain later how that works into getting that certain tone. So keeping that in mind, you know, how he's using the scale, how he's getting the certain tone. The other thing too that's important is setting up variations for statements, phrases, or motifs. Now, what's really important about this entire song with the opening phrase, it highlights a few things. This anticipation for this B, from that seventh to that tonic. And as I explained earlier, the relationship between that G, that sixth degree, and that F sharp. And in the middle of everything is that fourth and fifth that kind of glue it together. So, keeping that in mind, we look at the variations besides the opening phrase. Towards the middle of the song before it gets intense. So what's being highlighted is that anticipation for that B, the relationship between that G and F sharp, with the fourth in place, and of course you'll get the fifth in there. So that's really important about those variations and motifs. Now, going back onto talking about things in a narrative way, in any kind of story, there's conflict, which is what we've been playing. What the phrases are about is the conflict part of it. But the other part is setting up that climax you need to resolve at some point, and that's really important for any story. And what Kirk Hammett decided to do was brilliant. he uses these ascending arpeggios that build tension. I'm going to play it really slow. Now, what's really important is setting up that anticipation. What he does with those arpeggios, he varies all of them individually. So it feels like the tension is coming out, it's about to erupt, and it does. Earlier I talked about bending, how it could be its own statement or part of a phrase. In this last example, it's its own statement. And of course, after the climax you resolve, he descends down the fretboard. And usually, I mean, when I was younger, after that, when the song started to fade out, I just turned the track because I couldn't hear the rest of the solo. But when you think of it as a narrative way, what's really important, earlier I talked about the word hope in the song, how it's centered around that. When you think about things in a narrative way, yes, the song starts to descend and the song starts to fade, but if you check the clip that I played, there's a lot more at the solo at the very end, even as it's fading out completely. Keeping in mind the subject material of the song, how dark it is, and what it's about, it's very dark. Even though the song has to end, even though it has to fade, the guitar playing becomes even more lively and more unhinged. So even though the song had to end, the guitar playing didn't. So that was my interpretation of the song, and I really loved it. I just really wanted to highlight narrative playing because I don't think it gets talked about enough. I know this wasn't a technical lesson and there wasn't a lot of theory behind it, but I think it's one of those things that it's good to interpret songs that way because it gives you a lot of ideas, and that's what I really wanted to highlight. So thank you guys for joining me today. I hope you have a great day.